Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Gospel Addict Podcast. On this podcast, we are going to be looking at Matthew chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17, at least doing an overview. And Jim and I both teach this men's Bible study. We teach through the Bible in 2 years, through the whole Bible in 2 years.
Well, not just us.
Not just us. There's other teachers as well. And so what we like to do is while we're preparing, we like to make a podcast on some of the observations that we make. And then when we teach, we usually broadcast that podcast. And then sometimes we do a reflection of like what we wish we would have taught on. So anyway, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapters 14 through 17 as an overview. Jim, how are you?
I'm doing okay, Greg. Doing okay. Excited to do this podcast. I always amazed that we talk about passages of scripture together and read through these things, and I learned things during the course of the podcast, which is just iron sharpening iron, and two people, looking at the word and having the Holy Spirit illuminate it. So,
yeah, we used to do this. We used to have just phone calls.
Yeah,
you and I
right.
just used to talk on the phone, and we would kind of try to help each other. And
we
then,
did last night a little bit. For last night, we're talking for an hour, and so we should have recorded it because
I know.
Wrestling with these spiritual ideas, and what do you think? And I think the average Christian does too. Like, well, if that's true, then how does this work? And trying to understand, and pray that it illuminates it.
So what I realized is like the podcasts that I love to listen to are the ones that we're kind of like you're listening in on a phone call,
right?
And we were just having these amazing conversations, so we just decided let's just make it a podcast.
They were amazing to us.
They're amazing to us. And we're not theologians. A lot of times we share things that, we're okay. We might be wrong on things. We're doing our best to stay true to the scripture, but I don't know that anybody has a perfect theology, because if you did, you would be God.
Well, and if you got close, it's only because God revealed that to you and gave that to you as a gift by faith, right? So even if you get it right, it's all due to him.
Right. But one thing we are convinced of is the good news of the gospel is the best news ever.
Amen.
Not just for our salvation, but for our sanctification.
That's right.
And we think that it's one of the lost teachings in the church today, that churches are not teaching that not only is salvation by grace alone, but sanctification is by grace.
That's right.
We often kind of fall back to our default setting of the human heart, which is towards works righteousness and and legalism. And so many people get so discouraged as they become followers of Christ, because they're just trying so hard to be a good Christian by doing things. It kind of trying to grow spiritually from the outside in instead of from the inside out, and really practicing gospel-driven sanctification, which is what we believe in. But Jim, let's just dive into what are some of your thoughts as you overlook these chapters. I mean, this is four chapters, a lot of things happening. There's feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on the water, lots of things happening. What are some of your thoughts at this point?
A couple things. So I've got several hundred pages of commentary I'm trying to plow through, and again get some insight and understanding. And by the way, people might say, what are you guys talking about? If you're a Christian, you might say, I've been to Bible studies and 6 of us get together and open the Bible and talk about it. And this is just, I don't know if we've ever clarified this in the podcast, Greg, but we have about 50 people come, and about 20 to 25 on Zoom will join live, and then maybe 50 to 75 will watch the video of the Bible study later. And so long ago, they decided the format for this is not just, get it in tables and talk in small groups, but have one person put the work in layman, although I know you're in professional, full-time ministry, Greg, but you're not like a pastor. So it's not like you just take one of your sermons off the shelf. This is generally, you just go around, you get your assignment. You say, okay, you're going to teach on Matthew 14 to 20. So on top, like for me, on top of my day job, put in 30, 40 hours of work to put a coherent presentation together so that everybody can benefit from that and learn from it. And then the challenge is we have an hour and 15 minutes. And it's not like you give it like a 20-minute sermon and shake people's hands at the door like a pastor does. It's all open for Q&A and interruption and disagreement and rebuttal live in real time, and which makes it a Bible study, which means everyone's wrestling with it. And, so it's just wonderful. But you're trying to put the time in to do scripture justice and understand it. So anyway, I have spent some time in the passage. The passage for everyone's benefit is Matthew 14 through 20. It's 7 chapters. So if you go to it, if you put us on pause right now and go to Matthew 14, Matthew 14 through 20, it would take you half an hour more, 40 minutes just to read it.
At least.
Yeah. So around that. And there's, I don't know, I didn't count them up, 20, 30 really great stories. Starts off with the beheading of John the Baptist. You got Jesus feeding the 5,000. There's the transfiguration. Just one after another after another. And if you are a Christian and you've been going to church your whole life, or even recently, you realize most people who speak on this will pick 3 or 4 verses and speak on that. They'll pick one story and speak on that. And this is chock full of them. So what do you do? So what I try to do is I'll give an overview of the whole thing. And I got some preliminary thoughts, Greg, but they're half baked. So this is where this is the pre-podcast. I appreciate doing this. And so interrupt me and tell me when it makes sense, or if you have things to add, or stories or illustrations, that's really helpful. So here's the quick overview of the 7 chapters. And I got this from one of the commentaries I was reading, that there's basically three themes in this passage. And the one is that this is a shift in Jesus' ministry to a more private teaching of the 12, that he's doing a lot of public ministry to this point. And now you have verses like Jesus, I'm looking at 14 verse 13, after Jesus hears that John the Baptist is beheaded. It says, now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And so there's Jesus withdrawing from the crowds, pulling back to try to teach the disciples privately. There's a scene in chapter 17 where the disciples are trying to heal a demoniac, someone who's possessed by a demon, and Jesus heals the demoniac. And then right after that, the disciples come to him privately and they say, why couldn't we do this? And so he's teaching them privately. And there's a whole bunch of verses like that where he's withdrawing from the crowd and pulling away and going to a secluded place and teaching them privately. So he'll tell a parable, but then he tells them the real explanation, right? So that's phase in his ministry where he's doing that. And then secondly, that's the first theme, private teaching of the 12. And the second theme is repeated failures of the 12 to understand what he's doing. So it's again and again, and it's pretty obvious if you go through and read it, they always sound like dolts, like they just don't get it, they don't understand. And look, I mean, and I always feel bad about that, because I feel like if you and I were there, well, you'd have picked it up, Greg. I'd be like, I don't get it. Like the slow, it's
I don't know.
too hard on the disciples, like this is a sea change in thinking and everything. It's Jesus. It's radically different, his way. And so they always sound like they just don't get it. So for example, he feeds 5,000 and then later 4,000 people are hungry there, and they have no clue. And he had just fed 5,000 people by a miracle, making from 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he feeds 5,000. But the next time it happens, and it's not much long after, where they're like, yeah, it was no idea what to do.
Right.
Don't you remember we just went through this exact scenario where, right? They could even ask Jesus, we don't know how you did it, but could you at least whip up the food like you did last time? But no, nothing. And there's another one where he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And what he's talking about is their legalism. So he's like, it's a cooking illustration. Leaven, you add it to bread, it leavens, a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. If you put leaven in, it spreads among the dough. And you can't put leaven in and then take it out later, right? And so it's a spiritual warning. And they're like, oh, it's because we crossed the lake or wherever they were, and we forgot to bring bread, and he's mad at us because we forgot to bring bread. That's like it's just they give exactly the wrong lesson from what he's trying to do, and he has to kind of hit him over the head and say, no, that's not what I meant. So private teaching, repeated failures to understand, and then the third theme is growing, but small but growing glimmerings of faith starting in the disciples. So and once you understand that theme, so many of the stories connect and
Mm,
start to be coherent. And you say, that's the theme. That's what's happening. Like, so Jesus walks on the water, right? Comes out to them. There's a famous scene where the disciples are all in the middle of the lake, and it's like a Sea of Galilee, which I think, Greg, I know you've been to several times. And a big storm comes up, and then Jesus walks out on the water to them. And there's a moment where Peter says, Lord, if it's you, call me to come out in the water to you in chapter 14. And Jesus says, come. And so for a minute there, Peter is walking on water.
right.
Right. But then he starts to sink.
Amazing.
Amazing. But a human being, not the only human being who's ever walked, literally for a moment there, walked on water. And there's so much to that story. You could spend an hour just talking about just that story. Right. Like I got this quote, Spurgeon said that Peter was closer to Jesus when he was sinking than when he was walking on the water, because he's sinking, and he said, and he still knows that Jesus is the only one who can save him. He says, Lord, save me. So there's so much just in that story to unpack. But for this purpose, it's just for the example of saying it's showing this growing fits and starts, growing, glimmering bits of understanding. Um, the story of the Canaanite woman is like this. I love this story. It's not the disciples growing, but it's just it's a showing of faith. This is the one where she's begging for something. They're not in Israel or a Jewish area. They meet this woman, and he's begging for Jesus, and Jesus says to her something very harsh. He says, "It's not right to take the food from the children and give it to the dogs." And the metaphor he's using is the food the children is like the messages for the Jewish people, and it's not right to throw it to dogs like you Gentiles. And she could have been so insulted and said, I can't believe, how dare you call me a dog? But she buys into his definition of her, doesn't argue with it at all, and says, Lord, even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the master's table, even the dogs. So she
Wow.
accepts his definition of her as a dog. And Jesus says, this kind of faith, he just remarks about her faith. And he only does that twice in all the gospels. He does that with her, he does that with the centurion who's got a sick child. The centurion is the one who says, remember the other story? It's not in this section, but he says, I too am a man under authority, and I have people that I say go, and they go, and come, and they come.
Yeah.
And because the centurion says, Jesus is going to go to his house. And he says, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come into my house.
Right. Just say the
And
word.
just say the word. I know you have the authority, and B, I'm not worthy. And both him and the Canaanite woman together are the two people that Jesus were just says, wow, look at this faith. Because
Mm.
they are in touch with the reality of how lost and blind they are. So there's a glimmer there. It's not one of the disciples, but it's her. Um, there's Peter, who has this wonderful confession of Jesus.
Chapter 16.
Yes.
Yeah. At
Um,
Caesarea Philippi,
yes.
where, where Jesus says, who do the people say that the Son of Man is? And
And
then, they say, well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers correctly, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yeah, and then Jesus blesses them and says, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
right,
Um,
right. And then
yeah. And then a few seconds later, Jesus tells them about his death and resurrection. And Peter rebukes him and says, no, this will never happen to you.
right. And what does
And,
Jesus say to him?
and Jesus turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me, for
Right,
you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.
right.
Yeah, that's an amazing, amazing story.
Well, they're both amazing. Those two things in Peter's life are both amazing in their own right. The confession, the great confession, right?
Right.
He just comes out and says it, and he started to really get it. But then right after that, and the juxtaposition is there, I think, on purpose to show, look, it's just fits and starts at this point. They're just it's one step forward, two steps back. They're kind of getting the idea, but not really, right? Or it's just slowly sinking in.
As Jesus is marching towards the cross.
Yeah, right, right. So look at the Transfiguration, famous, great story. We could spend the whole time talking about that, right? Jesus is up in the mountain, and Elijah and Moses come and appear to him, people that have been dead for a couple thousand years, and it's just an amazing. And Jesus' face starts glowing like the sun, right? He's transfigured before them, and so much in that to unpack, right? So you have like Elijah and Moses represented the law and the prophets, testifying to Jesus. Jesus drawing friendship and comfort from two human beings, not angels. There's a lot of things just in that story. I think you talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So we could just do that story. But the point is that Peter says, remember what Peter says to them when they're up there? Kind of blurts
Let's
out something
let's
stupid.
build let's build three shelters.
I could build some booths for you if you'd like a booth. Like, just so has nothing to do with the spiritual magnificence and
Yeah.
weight of what's happening here. Um, Jesus is going to get a taste of glory. He's like, I wonder, actually, I don't know, on that one, Greg, honestly, I wonder if it was raining or something. And he's just watching them in the rain. And he says, I could be helpful here, and I could build a booth for you if you'd like. And he's trying to find some way to
Some
help.
people some people speculated he was so nervous
Right.
or so like uh yeah, so nervous, he just was spurting out things. Um
Nonsensical.
but he actually, I mean, that's pretty powerful. I mean, he um and that also is kind of an insult to Jesus, putting all three of those guys on the same level.
Oh, wow. Boy, I never thought about that before.
He's kind of like say, "Hey, I'll build three shelters for you, the same shelters." He's kind of like putting them all on the same level, and Jesus is thinking, "No, I am greater than Moses and
Oh,
Elijah. I am." Um,
wow. I never thought about that. That's interesting. He must have thought, if I'm going to build shelters, it's going to last a long time. You're going to be here for a while. Maybe they were. Maybe they watched him talk for like 4 or 5 hours, and after a while, he's like, this is going to go on, for days. I can do something. I can add to this. Anyway, it seems so out of place. It's a great example of how you would never make this up, right? If you were just people say, oh, these scriptures were doctored by the church later to consolidate their power. That's the Da Vinci Code theory, right? You would never write Peter the rock on which the church is built saying, acting like adult, like something, just saying something stupid. Jesus doesn't even acknowledge it. It's like, yeah, whatever.
right.
It's just I know you're nervous. It's one of those stupid things you blurt out, but it's recorded in the Bible.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway, fits and starts, glimmers of faith, a little bit at a time. Um, and then I think in the other one I have is it's also from chapter 17 where the transfiguration happens, and that's the demoniac when they're trying to heal the demoniac, and they're all trying to heal it, and the Jesus has to come along and do it because they can't drive the demoniac out.
Mm,
And Jesus says, and they say to Jesus, why couldn't we do it? Right? Why could we do it? And he says, because of the littleness of your faith. So Jesus is kind of acknowledging, and that kind of is the theme of this. Okay, it's the littleness of your faith, and all through these 7 chapters, it's growing. You're getting exposure to it. You're
yeah.
gonna see glimmers of it. Some nice one of Peter's confession: "You are the Christ, the Son of the Living God." Right? Okay, great. You walked on water for a minute there. Great stuff. But it's all fits and starts, and it's one step forward, two steps back.
Yeah. And then they
So,
start talking about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom.
well, that gets to the second theme, and the second theme I want to pick up on. So the first thing I want to talk about when I actually polish this into more of an actual talk, to lead it is, that thought of three themes: private teaching, repeated failures to understand, and then small glimmerings of faith. But then I want to go into what you often talk about, which are 3 ways to live, right? There's people think there's 2 ways, the religious way and the irreligious way, right?
Yeah.
But there's a third way to live.
Right. Which is to follow Jesus.
That's right, the
I mean,
gospel.
that's the whole thing that Jesus is he's laying, he is the third way. He is, you know,
Right. And
and
so
that's why it's interesting, just Jesus's ministry, how you had the tax collectors and sinners on the one hand, and then you had the Pharisees and Sadducees on the other hand. You had the religious people or the irreligious people and the religious people. And
right.
and Jesus is um you know presenting that third way, you
Yeah.
know. Um well, how do you see that coming out?
Well, so the irreligious way, this section starts with Herod and his beheading of John the Baptist, and he's just a political figure who liked to talk to John the Baptist about spiritual things, had him under lock and key, didn't bring him to trial, and then his wife was named Herodias, not to retell the whole story, but basically he had married his brother's wife, and John the Baptist said, speaking truth to power, said, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing that. And Herodias was opportunistic because she traded up from one brother to the more powerful brother, and she hated John the Baptist, and so she had her daughter dance it doesn't describe exactly how she danced, but she danced in such a way that Herod said, I'll grant any request.
Up to
So
half of my kingdom.
that's right. And so the
Why
mother,
in the world? Why in the world do ultra wealthy people say stuff like that?
well, you could also say, why are men such pigs? So because there's some you've all the savvy to build this kingdom and to get to the point where he was not a king of the whole thing. He was a tetrarch, which means a quarter king. So he was the king of
Right.
this. Yeah, he wasn't even Jerusalem. He was in Judea, this Sea of Galilee. So he's not the Caesar, right? He's a local.
Right. Well, why doesn't it's funny when, you hear that request made, um, more than, several times. Why doesn't somebody just say, "Yeah, okay, I'll take half the kingdom."
Great. Anything you want. Well, okay.
I'll take half.
49%, right? Go right up to the end. I don't know. But no, the mother says, bring John the Baptist head on the platter. So Herod has him killed. But I didn't realize this. That was not only against Jewish law to do that, it was against Roman law too. He didn't give John a trial. He just killed him.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, but Herod, and then Herod
He didn't
later.
want to. It says that, when she asked for that, he was like, "Oh, he never, he never,
That's
that was
right.
almost worse than her taking half the kingdom."
Well, he felt bad about it. Later, he was superstitious because he saw Jesus maybe as John the Baptist coming back from the dead.
Yeah.
Keller's got a great sermon on this. He's got a great sermon on everything, but he starts by saying this story is a horrible, horrible tragedy. But the tragedy isn't John the Baptist. The tragedy is Herod, because there's a moment where he's in conversation with John the Baptist and has an opportunity to be saved. And later, when he meets Jesus, Jesus is just dead silent, and your window's closed. And behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone comes and opens the door, I will dine with him and he with me. Revelation 20. But there's a moment. Today is the day.
Yeah.
To saved, and the moment doesn't always there forever. And for Herod, it was there with John the Baptist, and later when he met Jesus, the door was shut. Sorry, your time's
Wow.
back. So it's a horrible tragedy. Nevertheless, Herod is an example of the irreligious way of life, organizing life and engineering life for what's in it for me.
Yeah.
Maximizing power, staying in power. Later, by the way, I don't know if this is in the Bible or just as legend or history. His wife Herodias asked him to go to Caesar to get more power from the other brother is Herod Antipas, who anyway, he goes says, get more power, and it backfires. He's banished.
Oh,
Sent to Gaul, which is France. He dies in
yeah.
France. So he's pursuing life for me, right? Life is for me. And that's the irreligious way. How do you maximize life for you? Because life is all about you. What's in it for me, right? And
Yeah.
that's the irreligious way. The religious way is the Pharisees. They show up a couple times in here, and but they're basically religious people who say, "Look, I have presented to God a clean life, nothing but clean living. I have worked hard to climb up the ladder, and I am a good person. God owes me. Has to bless me." So this is basically saying that's religion, which is always what's in it for me. I do this, and I do it for a reason, so that I can be rewarded, so I can be blessed. What's in it for me? And what I want to contrast, and this is a theme that I saw through the whole thing, is the gospel way. And I know we've talked this many times: irreligious way, religious way. Gospel is not that way. It's the third way. People think there's two ways to live, but there's really three. But the gospel way, the key word that kept coming up with all this for me was the word nothing, nothing. And so if you say the first question is, what do you do to contribute to your salvation? The answer is nothing, right? Beautiful quotes from Luther's commentary in Galatians. Actually, he's at a last Bible study, so I don't know if I'll use that in this one. But the idea is like, is there anything for us to do to contribute to our salvation? No, nothing. Nothing. You don't bring anything to the table. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace. See you next time.